timing is so good for today's interview because, of course, we were just talking to someone this morning who's dealing with, as many of you are, a child who is being put in a lot of danger, physical and otherwise, and really needs some help figuring out how to navigate that. We know how often when terrible things happen to children and parents try to protect them. I see you, Julia. Let me get you on here. Parents try to protect them. If there's not an actual abuse, then often the script is flipped on them, and they're painted to be the unsafe parent for keeping the kid away from somebody. So I am so thrilled to have met Julia, who will introduce herself in a second, because she has such an extensive background in many of the things that some of you have lived through personally, and just things that our community always is asking for information on. So before Julie, you even introduce yourself, just given your experience, I'm talking about general abuse. If your child's disclosed to you, or if somebody else tells you that something terrible is happening to your child, is there something you should absolutely not do? Like, what is a mistake you see parents make?
Yeah, so first of all, hi Lisa. Hi everybody out there in Instagram outer space. Um, I'm grateful to be here. So I would say the number one thing that I encourage parents to do upon disclosure, right, is to believe your children, believe people when they disclose. In all of my years of working with survivors, I've heard tons and tons and tons of stories that sound truly unbelievable. That doesn't mean that they're not true in exactly the way that people describe them to be. So if I could, the number one advice that I would give parents, things not to do not brush off a disclosure. No matter how unbelievable it may sound, no matter who a child may be disclosing abuse having occurred with, right? If it sounds like somebody and you think, oh yeah, that this is a person who I don't trust or who I know to be unsavory in some kind of way or whatever, that might feel a little bit more believable. But if you should hear that your child is disclosing, or if a person in your life, not only a child, right, is disclosing something from somebody who sounds like an unbelievable perpetrator, an upstanding citizen, somebody who is otherwise trustworthy, and that to you sounds like it couldn't possibly be true, believe them anyway.
Mm.
Believe people, believe children when they disclose things, even when they sound unbelievable. There's little risk to believing. I know that that's a complicated sentence that I just said, but there's little risk to believing as compared to the harm that can be done by conveying an attitude of disbelief. One of the main reasons why people, children and adults, do not disclose various forms of abusive experiences is for fear of not being believed.
Mhm.
So absolutely the number one thing that I would encourage parents to do is believe your children when they disclose things to you, and make that belief explicit. I believe you, right? Say those words literally to your child over and over and over again. And then there are other kinds of ways to behave towards people to let them know and convey that same attitude of belief. But that's incredibly important upon disclosures of abuse.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know we were just talking, and we want to make clear that you don't work with children, you work with older people, and many of the people you work with have been through, same as our community, they've been through abuse themselves. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens when we are abused, and when we see that our children are in danger of or are already being abused. So Julia, why don't you officially introduce yourself and tell people about your background, which is very impressive.
Sure, and thank you. So I'm Julia Hochstadt, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm licensed to practice in New York and New Jersey, meaning Clients of mine need to be physically located in either of those two states when I'm providing services to them. I do consult and collaborate and speak nationally, though, as well. And for many, many years, I've specialized in working with primary survivors and secondary survivors. Secondary survivors meaning loved ones, family members, friends of people who have been impacted by particular kinds of crises and trauma, more specifically, things like childhood sexual abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And some of your community may be aware, but for those who aren't, April is actually international, but National Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So I'd be thrilled to sit here and talk with you about what we're going to talk about today at any time during the year, but more specifically, I do a lot of training and education outreach opportunities during April for Sexual Assault Awareness Month and October for DV Awareness Month. So I'm really happy to be here with you today. And as you said, yes, my clinical practice is primarily focused on working with adolescents starting at about 15 and up, adolescents and adults. But that being said, certainly many of my clients, more specifically those who are in high conflict or DV situations, either current or past, have children who are below the age of 15. So I have those kinds of conversations and provide support and navigation assistance, often with the parents of children who are below the age of 15.
Yeah, and that's why I thought you'd be the perfect person to talk about this topic with, because you do work with adults who can hopefully do things to help in these situations. So what about if a parent suspects that something's going on? Imagine if it's like a really, really young child, or they're just looking at signs from a child where maybe they're regressing. Let's say it's me. I see something's happening. I see my child is behaving very differently. What are some things that I should be doing to avoid those legal missteps? Because so often people do things that they think is right, and then it ends up biting them.
Yeah. So, well, as a non-attorney, right, and I collaborate often with attorneys and folks who are engaged with attorneys, but I would say absolutely these are questions to run past a legal mind, right?
Mhm.
And certainly somebody who is informed of these kinds of scenarios and family dynamics and relationship dynamics, which not all attorneys or legal minds, legal experts are. Um, but I would say, first and foremost, I want to empower your listeners and your audience to trust their gut, right? If you know your kid best. So if you have a sense that something is a little bit off, not quite right, if you think that you're noticing changes in your child, trust that gut. We don't always know what our gut is trying to signal to us, but we generally do know when that gut alarm bell is ringing. What it's ringing to indicate, we're not always sure of. But rather than wondering or thinking, is something going on? Am I, that second guessing that I think people often find themselves doing, pay attention and investigate. I think that becomes a tricky thing to pay attention to. In my practice, I'm working a lot with people who have been told and abused and gaslit, often for years and years and years. You're no good. You're not smart. You can't do this. You're a lousy parent, which is meant to erode a person's sense of themselves as being a knowing person, right? A good parent, an autonomous decision maker. So it can really cloud a person's sense of what is my gut instinct? Is my gut instinct right, or is my gut instinct usually wrong? So it can be very difficult, I think, especially for parents, to trust those senses that they know to be true when they have been in a relationship with a person who in various forms, sometimes for a long time, has been trying to erode that sense of self. Um, but I would say if you're noticing things, changes in behavior, changes in preferences, slip in grades, friendship changes, mood changes, lean into that as opposed to, sort of cautiously watching and waiting. There can be a time and place for that also. But I would say lean into that. I mean, ask your kids, talk with your kids, pay attention to those kinds of signs and signals. Know your supports and resources and utilize them as you feel comfortable. If you are a person that feels without support, without resources, without local friends and family, or even friends and family not local but far away, there are opportunities to develop those kinds of supports, but it may mean that you're reaching out to your child's teacher or the guidance counselor or social worker at school or the pediatrician. Um, if you are a person out there who's listening to a talk like this today and you're saying to yourself, I don't even have any of those resources, you have resources here, right? Reach out to Lisa, reach out to me. I may not be licensed to practice in the state in which you live, but that doesn't mean that I wouldn't be willing to get online with you, have a conversation with you, and help to see where we might be able to get you otherwise connected for support for you and for your child.
Oh, Julie, I so appreciate, I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate that as you were answering the question, you started with the perspective of where most of us are at. We're feeling like we have our whole sense of identity eroded. We don't even trust our own judgment, and how difficult that is, because I think people say, well, just trust your gut. But for someone who's been living in a coercively controlling relationship, that's gone. I
Right.
mean, we know about complex trauma and the effect it has on the brain, and where you just don't even know who to believe, especially yourself anymore. So I really appreciate that you started answering that with that question with that. So one of the big things that we see all the time are people who have to co-parent with an abusive ex, and we're really scared that the ex is abusing the children, whether there's enough proof or not, but we feel it in our gut, but we can't make it stop. So safety planning, we always talk about how important that is. Is there anything that one can do to start establishing a safety plan when the order says the kid goes back and forth and I can't withhold because I don't have enough yet, or else I'm going to get in trouble? Like, tell us a little bit, if you know, of ways to safety plan for the child specifically.
Yeah. And I want to acknowledge that for a lot of people, safety planning, it can be invaluable, right? But it can also feel like it pales in comparison to dropping your kid off, handing your child over to somebody that in your parent gut you feel is truly
Mhm.
unfit. And unfortunately, you may have experienced, you may be experiencing a systems failure, in regards to, your process, your legal process, your court system process. Um, uh, that being said, there are many, many things that you can do yourself to safety plan, that you can talk about and encourage your children to consider when it comes to safety planning. I'm a big believer in having hard conversations with people of all ages. As far as I'm concerned, most, if not all things are talk aboutable. Um, it depends on your kid. It depends on the age of your child. Depends on the developmental and cognitive stage that your child is at. For example, not all 12-year-olds are created equally. Not all 6-year-olds are created equally. Not all 27-year-olds are created equally, right? But I still believe that these kinds of conversations are critical and havable with people of all ages. Um, take some practicing for everybody to, I think, feel comfortable talking, especially about sensitive topics with children specifically. But there are resources to practice those kinds of things, right? I'm one of them. You might be another one of them. Community resources exist to have these kinds of conversations, to brainstorm. Um, Already this week, and the week is not over, I've had any number of conversations with people in my practice about safety planning considerations for themselves, but also with their children. And that's true for people who are continue to be in relationships, but who have also left and who are attempting to co-parent or otherwise parallel parent in high conflict or DV situations. So, things like whether or not you have a child who's old enough to have their own cell phone or to have their own smart device so that in an emergency, they could make a call to the non-offending parent, for example, to a neighbor or to other family friends locally. Worst case scenario, to calling 911, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we dial 911? And when somebody answers, what are we going to say? What are we going to describe? A conversation that I was having with somebody yesterday was around that the offending parent struggles significantly with mental health, um, and also may or may not be taking their medication as prescribed. So if that person is making threats against themselves, or if that
Mm-hmm.
person is making threats against the kids, right? Or if you walk, 12-year-old walks into the room and sees, in this case dad is the parent that we're concerned about, that he's unresponsive,
Mm-hmm.
that he's impaired to the point where he's not making sense. Or if you happen to be in a car and to talk to kids about recognizing when things in their gut feel kind of off and what that might feel like and what you can do in a situation like that, versus if there's more of an explicit threat, like parent is saying X, Y, and Z, parent is doing X, Y, and Z to me or to my younger or older sibling, or if I see something happening between parent and somebody else that makes me feel uncomfortable. So I said, if a child is old enough to have access to a device where they can call for help, not every child has that kind of device. Not every child is old enough to have that kind of access. So what can we do, planning for different types of scenarios, including different times of day, different kinds of locations? I encourage my clients to think about safety planning 24/7, 365. If it's during the day, if it's at night, if it's during the week, if it's on a weekend, if it's on a vacation, right? If part of my safety plan includes, I'm going to run across the street to the neighbor's house. Well, what happened? That's great. What happens? First of all, do the neighbors know about that? Have you talked with them at all about having that kind of access? What happens when the neighbors go away for their spring break vacation? Do you have another neighbor that you've been able to identify? How does the plan pivot or change depending on different types of scenarios and situations? And I think that these conversations, as I said earlier, are certainly havable no matter somebody's age, no matter somebody's ability, no matter somebody's developmental stage, etc. The point is having these kinds of conversations and having them not one and done, but over and over and over again. It doesn't have to happen every day or every week, right? But the way that I think about safety planning for these kinds of situations is very similar to the way that the fire department talks to us about fire safety planning. They don't want us to talk about this and think about this when we smell smoke or see flames. Fire department encourages families to actually think about this a couple times a year when we change the clocks, right? They want us to change the batteries in our smoke detectors and revisit our family fire safety plan a couple of times a year. The time to do this kind of safety planning is not when there is an acute emergency taking place. That's the time that you want people to be able to enact whatever their safety plan may be. So as your children change from fall sports to spring sports, or they go from fourth grade to fifth grade, or they go from the school year to whatever their summer plans may be. Um, as things evolve and change, so does safety planning.
Hmm. So it's at transitions, I'm thinking. And also what I like what's built into this as well is giving kids a sense of agency, making them feel like there's things that they can do and talking through. So it's not just like I'm stuck, I'm helpless. It's like, okay, let's figure it out. Again, the age and everything else, but there's ways to be creative and make them feel like they can even come up with some ideas of what might work.
Absolutely. And I think, again, I think kiddo appropriate, age, developmental stage appropriate, the more bought in your children can be, the better, right? If your kids know their routine differently than we may know their routine. We know the adult grown up version of maybe like the logistics of and the coaches, and these are the contact numbers, right? But how things actually play out on a child's level and what may stand out as the most important factors or dimensions to these kinds of plans from a kid's perspective matter very much, certainly also. And I would say the more that you're able to engage your children around these kinds of conversations, again, using age appropriate, kid appropriate language and approach, the better. And I think people are oftentimes surprised at how their children are able to pinpoint certain things about these kinds of conversations too.
Yeah, as you said that, I was thinking about how sometimes when you ask a child a question about what their idea might be, they might come up with something that you hadn't thought of that works really well for
Mm-hmm.
them. So rather than just saying, here's some options, to say, what do you think?
Absolutely. And I think, as in terms of my work with clients, oftentimes a child's experience of what may be taking place in a home or in a relationship might have a lot of overlap with what the non-offending parent's experience is, but also could be very different at the same time.
Mhm.
Um, and I would say all of those experiences matter for many reasons, including how they might inform a person's safety plan.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I think I mentioned at the beginning when we first started that the timing of today's interview is perfect because earlier we were talking with someone who had a situation or has a situation where her daughter revealed that there had been some of the worst kind of abuse there can be for a child when she was very little. This is when this woman was still married. Um, Took her to the doctors. There was an investigation, but the child was too young and there were language barriers. So it wasn't documented or taken seriously. It happened several years later. The daughter confided again as it was happening. People got involved, but because of the impact, maybe, on the girl, that she was very reticent to talk and didn't open up to the professionals. There wasn't enough evidence. And again, it's not that it didn't happen, but it didn't rise to the level of it taken more seriously. So now the child has been forced into, it sounds like this very strange reunification therapy that involves exposure therapy, where she's not a toddler anymore, she's a tween, and she's saying, I don't want to participate because this person has been doing this to me for years and I don't want to go in the building. And of course, the person that we spoke to is being painted as an alienator. And I think about the different models of reunification, and one of them is this sort of forgive and forget, which clearly doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the person that we spoke to earlier today is being told to just be compliant. So there's this catch-22, right? Where she knows that this happened. Her daughter knows that it happened. There's documented things where people have paid attention, but it hasn't risen to the level. And my bottom line is this mother is feeling like, how do I balance still being forced to send our child to this therapeutic thing that is making things worse because her child is regressing
Mhm.
extraordinary, like really badly, and she just feels completely helpless. Any ideas?
I mean, well, for starters, my heart goes out to that mother and to that child. That's a devastating situation. Um, I would say, you know, hopefully, and perhaps it sounds like, but I'm not exactly sure, that person is connected to an attorney, who can help make recommendations legally around what somebody must do and what somebody has choice around, right? Which again, I think there in this kind of work, there are lots of tremendous wins often, but there are also lots of tremendous systems failures, right? Which I think it's important to acknowledge. This is our legal system. We do the best that we can within the confines of that system. Um, but for something like what you're describing, I would say first and foremost, around disclosures of, I'll say, abuse generally speaking, but more specifically, some of the data that I'm thinking of right now are around disclosures of sexual abuse, child sexual abuse. Um, One of the most important protective factors when a child discloses is in regards to maternal belief and maternal support. I imagine that again, in terms of the data that I'm thinking of in my brain specifically, it's specific around maternal support. That being said, I know and have to imagine that paternal support matters greatly also. But the number one protective factor is around a mother's response when her child discloses, even if child advocacy centers, even if attorneys, even if law enforcement are not supportive, which is a system, which are several systems failures, right? Maternal support is the number one protective factor for the trajectory of that child's life, right? So not only
Wow.
in childhood. So if nothing else, what I want mothers and generally speaking, broad strokes, parents to walk away from here, but this mother in particular to know is that if the system is failing you, is if the system is failing your child, but you are showing up for your child and you are advocating for your child and you have conveyed specifically and explicitly to your child that you believe what they have disclosed to you, that is the number one protective factor for that child's life, which I think it is not meant to be like, but don't worry, your kid will be fine. You're supporting your kid in the face of all of these other systems, which you may truly feel are not doing as much as they can. It matters when parents believe, more specifically when mothers believe, a child's disclosure. And so don't give up and don't quit. And I think that certainly having outlets for that child, but also for that parent, to have a space to process what this must be like for both of you, for all of you, knowing in your mom gut, in your parent gut, that something did happen to your child that either was not expressed completely for many good reasons, age of child, right? Fear from that child, not necessarily having full and complete language or memory or ability to share exactly what happened, which makes a lot of sense and is okay. Um, did not necessarily rise to the level of a particular kind of report or holding the perpetrator accountable, or which are unfortunately scenarios that I encounter all the time in my practice. I also work a lot with people who, again, experienced something in childhood, who are coming in for support at a different point in their lives. um, Experiencing abuse in childhood can be truly terrible. And it does not have to mean doom and gloom forever and ever. Healing from these kinds of things is absolutely possible. I see it happen all the time. every single day. People are resilient. And again, keeping in mind that when a child discloses, believing and making that belief explicit and doing what a person feels able to do, what a person is able to access in the form of support and resource matters very much, even when the systems that we have in place are not necessarily able to fully and completely support us as we might otherwise want them to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad to hear that. It is very comforting, even though you can feel so helpless as it's happening. But just to know that that matters, that the person that's the primary attachment figure is saying, "I believe you," and even though the rest of the world it's not doing what they should and the systems aren't working yet, hopefully something will happen. But we're going to keep advocating. So in the meantime, if I have to send my child, our child, I tell our clients don't say my child. If I'm sending our child to the other parent, there's nothing I can do. They know that I love them. And the child is still saying, why are you making me do this? Is there anything you found that a parent can say to comfort a child or to explain why the systems might be failing?
Um,
And I
you
know it
know,
depends on the age and development and everything else.
yeah, I mean, and I keep coming back to that because I think, I don't practice in a one size fits all way of doing things when it comes to anybody or any kind of situation, because I think that that's so important. Um, and I think it's a fine line to walk where, um, you don't want to necessarily um, make a child feel more unsafe than they may already feel, right? And as a parent, to want to acknowledge how a child may feel while being mindful of not necessarily projecting our own fears, right? Our
Mhm.
own overwhelming at times fears and concerns onto that child who, I'm thinking of some of the clients that I work with currently and have in the past who, you know, come to the very difficult, challenging decision themselves. I can leave. I have the option. I feel like I'm ready to make that kind of choice. But my kid doesn't necessarily have that same luxury, let's call it, right?
Yeah,
Because we're going to, so and so is going to fight me on custody and we're going to have to split custody and
that's
um
most people here. Yes.
yeah. Um, and how difficult that is. And for a lot of clients, and I'm sure it's true for a lot of people in your community here, a lot of people make the informed choice and decision not to leave because I can't stand the thought of not being here. I am a protective factor for my children. So we're all going to stay. I'm going to stay. Um, So it's a hard question to answer, right? Because, and again, I think that if somebody is able to, in your community, um, connect your child with their own supports, somebody who does specialize in providing therapy, providing different kinds of services to kids, it might offer a different kind of answer to this question than I can. But I think that, again, leaning into those kinds of conversations, even if they feel, I don't know what I'm going to say to my kid to make them feel better. We're both terrified. There's nothing that I can say that's going to take that away. Have the conversation anyway. Show up anyway. Encourage your child to share with you what thoughts they have, what concerns do they have, what fears do they have anyway. Um, and I think it's reasonable to in some way communicate to your child, I hear what you're saying. I'm so sorry that this is where we're at. We're going to do the very best that we can. I'll do the best that I can, which is all of these kinds of things. You're going to do the best that you can, which is going to be all of these kinds of things, even when that list may not feel, Julia, I don't have all of these. I have one thing that I feel like I can do. I have no things that I feel like I can do, right? I think that there's a way of having that kind of conversation sensitively, um, with your child. But it's something that you want to be very thoughtful about. There's not really like a quick answer that I could get. This is the perfect way to respond when you're terrified. You know, your kid is
Yeah.
terrified and you're dropping them off and saying, okay, I'll see you Sunday at 6 p.m. Um, but I do think that knowing what your resources are, knowing what kinds of supports you may have, um, and if you're a person out there who's listening and thinking to yourself, I have no support, I have no resources, again, I'm offering myself up to you as reach out to me. If you're in New York and New Jersey, we can have a particular kind of conversation. If you're elsewhere throughout the country, I'm happy to make myself available to find you what kinds of resources we might be able to find you in your local community. But you're not alone, is the bottom line. You're not alone. Your child is not alone. But I think it depends on lots of different things to figure out exactly what those supports and resources might look like for your family.
Yeah, and that's an honest answer because
Yeah,
there is no easy way to deal with this.
certainly not. And I know that for many people and these who are facing these kinds of family dynamics, relationship dynamics, um, leaving, right, where a lot of people, a lot of uninformed, well-intentioned, right, but uninformed people who might be ignorant to these kinds of relationship dynamics are very quick to say, oh, well, this is an unsafe situation, you got to get out of there. That is not the right answer for many, many people. And my job, I think of my job as showing up and supporting people exactly where they're at. And sometimes that means people are staying exactly where they are for safety reasons.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's we're going to make a plan to leave for safety reasons, right? So there's not one answer that makes sense for everyone. Um, but I do believe that these kinds of situations are figure outable. It just, you need to be speaking with people, in my opinion, who are savvy to these types of abusive relationship dynamics, which are very different and nuanced as compared to, I like to say, lots of people can hate one another. Lots of people can be jerks to one another. There are plenty of people who hate each other, who hate being married to one another, and they want to get divorced. And that's not domestic violence.
Right.
That's a qualitatively different animal altogether. And so, not all therapists, not all attorneys, right? Not all professionals, certainly not all lay people are expertly and well versed in these kinds of dynamics. And so, again, if I could encourage people just to sort of keep that in mind when you're able to, for these kinds of issues specifically, I think it's really important that you be connected, if possible, to people who are well versed, to people who are experts in these types of relationship dynamics, because the alternative, I think, could have really devastating implications for people.
Yeah, yeah. And so as you're saying this, I'm thinking, and now you are in, we are, the two of us are connected in each other's resource network. And it is so important to find professionals who know other professionals who are experts in things like this. So with that, Julia, how can people find you?
A great question. So my website is www.therapywithjulia, JULIA.com, all one word, no spaces, therapywithjulia.com. And as I said, I'm licensed to practice in New York and New Jersey, but I do collaborate and consult throughout the country and also internationally. I have a call set up with somebody next week who lives in Canada, not for therapy, but for a consultation. I also testify as an expert witness as it relates to DV, IPV, domestic violence, intimate partner violence dynamics, as well as sexual violence. Um, so if I can be a resource to people, again, if I'm able to provide clinical resource to people, therapeutic supports to people, in New York and New Jersey, I'm happy to do that. But I'm also happy to offer myself up as a resource to anybody who may not live anywhere near the tri-state area for me, but who's looking to connect to resources in their community. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm just always happy to provide support and education and training when I'm able to. So that goes for people who may be experiencing these types of things themselves, or for a family member or friend, or if there's a clinician out there, a provider out there of any variety. My background is working in healthcare settings with all different types of clinicians and providers and professionals. Anybody could at any time experience these kinds of things or be on the receiving end of a spontaneous disclosure of sexual abuse or sexual assault or domestic violence. And I really believe strongly that it's important, yes, to provide support to my clients, but also to other professionals, other people, friends, neighbors, right, who may hear or suspect that something is going on for a person in your life. And have no idea how to respond effectively, sensitively, in an informed way. So if anything like this is going on for anyone at any point in regards to anything like this, I hope your audience will consider to reach out to me as a resource.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia, for all of this. I cannot wait to follow up with that particular person. I already told her to watch the recording. I'm not sure if she's available now, but yeah, I think this provides a lot of helpful comfort as well as wisdom to our audience. So I really appreciate your being on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Like I said, I appreciate the opportunity to talk during the Awareness Month.
Yes, great timing. And this will not be our last conversation.
I hope not.
No. All right. Thanks again, Julia.
All right. Take
Okay.
care. Bye,
You too.
Lisa.
Bye.